You wanted to make a distinction before we continue between bilingual education and English as a second language?
Yes, I'd like to make that clarification, but before I do, I'd just like to mention that I've lived and worked overseas for many years, and a good education around the world, in every major country and city in the world, includes some element of second language or bilingual education. And in fact, traditionally in our culture, in our history in Western civilization, in the 19th, 18th, going back to the 17th century, being well educated was knowing your own language, knowing Greek and Latin. That's changed over the years, but being bilingual is a hallmark of high quality education all over the world, and it certainly should be in Arizona as well. But the distinction about bilingual and ESL is a critical one to frame the rest of our discussion. Bilingual, bi means two, lingual means language. So bilingual means working in two languages. Now in this country, obviously one of those is going to be English. There are many kinds of bilingual programs. In Arizona we talk mostly about Spanish and English, but there are many different types of bilingual. In the Midwest in the 19th century, bilingual meant German and English. Now here it means Spanish and English. ESL means English as a second language, teaching English to those students who didn't grow up speaking English. The interesting thing is that there is English as a second language in every bilingual program, but ESL programs use only English. So the thing to remember is that bi means two, ESL means one, but the bi includes English.
Okay. One other distinction, when we talk about second languages here, when I grew up we all started learning Spanish or French, I guess in 5th grade. Are we talking about eliminating those language programs totally, or would that be still a part of the education?
Well, we're used to thinking in terms of foreign languages or second languages with older students in our system here, even though it's a well-kept secret that the state of Arizona mandates a foreign language for elementary students as well. But typically we focus on English in the lower grades, and then when kids are older and have less facility for language, that's when we want them to start learning a second language. So it's rather curious.
This is not about that.
No, that's the foreign language debate is really a separate one.
Okay. And again, why would the two of you explain in a general way why you would like to see these types of programs eliminated?
My standpoint of ridding the schools of bilingual education is because, first of all, I think it's a misnomer. As they stated, bi means two languages. We're not seeing that. We're seeing more of a monolingual instruction. The students are being left in classes and being taught in their native language for many years, and sometimes up to 5 to 6 years, because now the theorists of bilingual education, the proponents, are stating that a student must be literate in speaking, reading, and writing in their own language before they're made the transition. They call it the facilitation theory. I think students, first of all, need to be taught English as quickly and as soon as possible, according to David Sosa, who has just finished a book of how the brain learns. In order for a student to pick up a second language, you need to do it between the ages of 0 and 10. And so that goes contrary to the bilingual education proponents. Not only that, I believe that our students need to be taught English as soon as possible so that they can compete in the educational system. Without learning to speak, read, and write English, you are crippling children, and so that's my stand.
A couple of mischaracterizations. Our proposition, or the California model, is not intent in teaching English and then academics, but rather in teaching academics in English. It's a known fact, and we've had reports from everybody, parents, especially in Tucson, in the Hispanic areas of town, that kids, after several weeks of being in America, after having come from Mexico, anywhere between the ages of 0 and 10 or 12, learn to speak English almost immediately with their friends. And in fact, in schools, many times they are already prepared to speak in English, to learn in English, to listen in English. And nevertheless, these kids are put into programs where they're going to be taught everything in Spanish. And what we're saying is these kids can pick English up so quickly that they can actually do academics in the early years, especially before they reach the age of 10. They can do the academics in English and learn English. Now, one of the arguments that people say is that we'll eliminate their capacity for Spanish. But we have to remind everybody that bilingual education was never meant, and it was never designed as a program to teach Spanish or maintain culture. The sole purpose of bilingual education from the very beginning was to teach English. And if we are going to begin to consider teaching of English and consider that the most important mandate of bilingual education, then I think it behooves us to necessarily make that the only mandate of bilingual education. As it is not. Too often, the issue gets so muddled that we have many bilingual proponents, directors and teachers, talking in terms of bilingual education in order to make people bilingual. That's a fallacy. That's a myth. Bilingual education does not create bilingualism. Kenji Hakuda, one of the most famous educational psychologists, a big proponent of bilingual education, has said so himself. It does not happen. So if we're going to teach English, let's say let's teach English and then let's go out and teach English.
Okay.
Too often, as Margaret said, kids are stuck in bilingual programs, you know, and these are defined in many ways, as we've said before. They are stuck in these bilingual programs for through the 7th and 8th grade. And these are kids who are doing the majority of their work in Spanish when they already know how to speak English. In fact, in many cases, kids in bilingual programs are kids who were born in America and spoke only English.
Okay, let's begin by talking about one of the concerns that I think any parent would have would be whether or not these programs are holding back the kids. We hear that having a second language really gives you an edge, and you touched on that. But I think one of the big concerns is that these kids are being held back, and that is really hurting their economic future. Could you address that?
They're not held back because they speak 2 languages?
No, that is actually hindering their success because they're not learning English.
Well, they're not learning English because they're not being taught in English.
Right.
They are being taught in Spanish. And of course, certainly in this society, if you don't learn to speak English and if you don't learn to communicate effectively in English, you just won't succeed. And this is the issue that we keep bringing up, that because kids are being taught in Spanish and not in English, kids don't develop a proficiency in English. I have taught high school in a bilingual feeder pattern for 12 years, and through the years I have noticed that the least prepared kids are these kids that come to us from these bilingual feeder patterns. Sometimes some of these kids come in with nothing but Spanish for 8 continuous years before they jump into our high school. And on many occasions, these are kids who were born in America.
Okay.
Yeah. Having been in a middle school 8th grade English teacher, I think it's interesting that we often lose sight of the fact that a lot of kids, quote-unquote normal kids, come to school in this country speaking English, but they take English for 12 years. And if they go to college, they take more English. Why is that? They come speaking to us in English, but knowing English in the school sense is knowing academic English. Nouns, verbs, prepositions, complex sentences, theme papers, theses. And it's true that students can come to us not speaking English and learn to speak English in a very short time. That doesn't equal school success. That doesn't equal a good education.
But what he's saying is being stuck in the bilingual programs is hindering these children.
Let me finish with that, and then I'll address the second issue about quote-unquote being stuck. Learning what a noun and a verb is can happen in any language. Once you know that, you know it. So students, if they're learning in Spanish in the early grades, they're still learning language. They're still learning the foundations of language that they can apply to any other language. They apply that learning in Spanish because it's more easy for them and more natural for them, and they apply that to English in the middle and the upper grades. If it's, I've heard a lot in the media about kids getting stuck in programs. I'd like to have some facts and some data behind that, because the state of Arizona, unlike California, has never mandated bilingual education. Arizona has never said you should do a bilingual education. And schools don't necessarily say to students or to parents, you should do bilingual education. It's an option.
Are there studies on how these types of bilingual programs have affected the success of...
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
Long-term
There are long-term studies that, over 14, 15 years. There are specific case studies of specific situations. There's a whole myriad of studies, and what complicates the issue is that there can be studies arguing both points. I think, again, from a common sense perspective, let's not let this debate become bilingual versus English. Bilingual is the best, the most superior way for kids to learn and achieve academically in English. You only learn how to read once, basically, is the theory behind bilingual education. So if we get these kids reading as quickly as possible, as early as possible, then those skills will transfer into learning another language.
Okay, when you said it was simultaneous, so that it was English, they were learning academics, and they're learning Spanish, or they're learning academics and they're learning...
All three.
No. They're learning academics, and they're learning English. They're learning English, but at the same time, they're not being denied access to math curriculum, to science curriculum. They can do math word problems in English. They can understand what photosynthesis. They can develop all of those kinds of things. But the key is we need to get these kids literate. If I'm illiterate and you're literate and we're both English speakers and try and learn French, who's going to learn it faster? You are, because you have academic skills that can transfer. And that's
a correlation that